this war, by some estimates, was the deadliest war of Americans, or what would become Americans, being the European settlers, by percentage of the population. It killed like 5 to 10% of the New England settlers, a higher percentage of the Algonquins. A guy named King Philip. King Philip, or Metacomet, Metacom, different names. He was an Algonquin who was seen as very, very...
A Native American named King Philip?
Well, they would take on English names.
Okay.
So I think that this was a name he chose himself, but it might have been given by the English. But at many times and in different places, people will adopt different names in different contexts, depending on what the culture is. But in our culture today, a lot of us would view it, yes, that's him. That's Metacomet, King Philip. So he was seen as violent, I would say, foolhardy, maybe not foolhardy, but he was seen as too, in the 1660s into the 70s, he was seen by others as too volatile. But at a certain point, the Native Americans, the Algonquins, they decided after 40 years of English settlers coming in, settlement, they decided it was time for war with the English colonies of New England. So we have the New England colonies that form into the New England Confederation at that time to fight the Eastern Algonquins, who before this were not a combined force. They were split up into many different tribes throughout New England who would have been at odds with each other. The Pequot, the Narragansett, the Wampanoag. Their main enemies would have been the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee, but they would have fought within themselves. The Narragansett, for example, fought with the English settlers against the Pequot in the Pequot War of 1635. But by the 1670s, with that cultural interaction with the English, they realized they needed to band together. And that's a very hard thing to do, just like Vercingetorix, another example, trying to unite the Celts who have these violent fights within themselves, trying to unite against the Romans. The Eastern Algonquins had to unite against the English, and they did, besides the Pequot, who were on the English side at that point. One of the only groups, the only major group, as far as I know. So King Philip then, when they decided we're going to fight this big war against the New England Confederation, which formed, if you want to pull up the New England Confederation flag, it's a flag that I love, being from New England, and my ancestors fought in this war, as well as actually one of my direct ancestors was killed in King Philip's War. This was an annihilation war at this point in the 1670s, and King Philip was chosen. Actually, I'm sorry, that's not the one I'm looking for. It's the pine. Oh, actually, that is the one they would have used there. That flag, but I was thinking of the one with the pine tree in the top left. That one right there. Yeah. This war, by some estimates, was the deadliest war of Americans, or what would become Americans, being the European settlers, by percentage of the population. It killed like 5 to 10% of the New England settlers, a higher percentage of the Algonquins. They were attacking each other's food supplies. They were burning each other out, burning down villages. Just awful, absolutely awful, complete annihilation war. But King Philip was chosen to lead at that point contextually because that was what they needed at the time. Whereas before, a warlike leader was not needed.
And the battles were going on from present day where to present day where?
So because the Pequot, who were in Connecticut, were on the English side, most of the battles did not occur in Connecticut because the Pequot were defending. So almost all of the battles were happening in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Some of them may have happened in what's now Maine, at the time was part of Massachusetts, as well as New Hampshire and Vermont. But mainly Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and a few in Connecticut near the borders to those states.
Okay. And what weapons were each side using?
Great question. Love that. So the Native Americans were using mostly bows with points of flint, obsidian, as well as repurposed copper that have huge stopping power as points on the arrows. They also would have used certain muskets, certain not rifles at this point, but muskets. But what you see in some of these early 17th century documents, even before King Philip's War and afterwards, is that the English would annotate what was taken when they come back, and certain muskets would be missing, the nicer ones. But they would the Native Americans would select which ones they took, and they would only select certain ones. Very, very quickly, they learned what was useful to them and what worked within their culture. And that was not only with warfare, but also with anything else. Like they might use a copper pot, or they might use certain metal objects to improve their canoes. And when I talked earlier about how I made a canoe, there are a lot of these finds from New England of these canoes, these dugouts, also called a mashoon in the Algonquin languages, but they very, very quickly, and this is why I tried to find an earlier one, incorporated these metal objects, copper and iron, into the construction of their canoes, and vice versa. The English saw these canoes, and they would buy these canoes from Native Americans, trade for them with guns or pelts, whatever they needed, as well as things like copper. So what you see when two cultures interact is a cultural diffusion of a sharing of culture, but it's not like the English pick up a bow and arrow like the Algonquins have. They use objects that make sense within their culture. So they would, because of the river, Connecticut, the name of the Connecticut River, Connecticut means Great Tidal River. So Connecticut River means Great Tidal River. That's
Tidal.
Yes,
Yeah.
tidal, Tidal. Yes, Great Tidal River. So Connecticut River, Great Tidal River. What the English called Irish canoes, because in their culture that's what they understood the dugouts to be, because they knew of them from Ireland, where similar dugouts were used. They would adopt the use of these because they were very good for river transportation, not for the ocean. At least the dugout canoes from New England were not good for the ocean. The Pacific Northwest natives, they make some very large ones out of redwoods that do go on the ocean, but they're not great for that. They're not stable. They don't have a high water line. So for river transportation, the adoption of the technology, they would adopt the materials to use within their culture. So obsidian, flint points, chert is something you'll find a lot in archaeology, but it's not a material that's often discussed. Actually, not obsidian, quartz. I've seen some with quartz. I think those were more ceremonial, but I've found some personally doing archaeology. So this war happens, and the Eastern Algonquins lose at the end. If not, the country would look very different today. I'm sure they would have eventually come back, but they lose, and that's kind of the end of serious resistance in New England.